I was reading an article in Scientific American Mind this morning, and it was about what they call spatial priming. Spatial priming is really interesting, and I think it kind of connects to some of the stuff I've been talking about in relation to the feelings associated with the sublime, but maybe to other things as well. I mean, what it's basically saying is that, oh god, let me get this right. Yeah, that that the way people respond to certain tasks varies according to how they are being primed to think before that, but that priming can be metaphorical. So if I can see if I can articulate exactly what the task was. People are shown images which are slightly embarrassing perhaps, slightly sexually provocative images, or in some cases slightly violent images, and then they're asked a series of questions which assay their tolerance of these images. So they might be more or less embarrassed, or they might be more or less anxious by these images, and that'll vary. But what they found is that they gave half of them a task beforehand, or they divide the group up and gave them different tasks beforehand. And the specific task was really simple. It was just a graphing task. They gave them a piece of graph paper, and they gave them a couple of points, coordinates, -2, -4, or -11 plus 12. Two sets of coordinates, and asked them to map those coordinates onto the graph paper. That was all they had to do. Half the group were given sets of coordinates which were quite close together. So the 2 points they would make on the graph paper would be quite close together. The other half of the group were given coordinates that would map as quite far apart. So one would be at one side of the graph paper, one at the other. So that half the group would end up with 2 dots on their graph paper which were really close, and the other would end up with 2 dots which were separated by quite a distance. And that was a task they gave them before. They showed them these images, which would provoke either anxiety or embarrassment to different extents. And what they found was that the group who had been given the task of graphing dots that were close together were much more likely to be embarrassed or anxious than the group who were given the task of plotting dots that were further apart, which is really weird. Your level of tolerance, your level of openness, your level of willingness to look at images which have a visceral effect depends on this graphing task beforehand. But the speculation goes that what's going on is when you do that task, you're activating a part of your brain which codes for space and separation. And if you're coding a part of the brain, if you're doing 2 dots that are close together, obviously that activation pattern is associated with proximity, closeness, perhaps even dependence. You start to see them as being closely linked, these 2 dots on the page. Whereas if you're doing the task that codes, that separates those dots, same part of your brain is activated, but this time it's coding in terms of distance, separation, detachment, apartness, all that kind of thing, spatial concepts. And then when you go into this second task, this task of looking at images which are either embarrassing or anxiety provoking, that spatial idea carries over into it. So if you've been primed to think in terms of closeness and proximity and dependence, and you look at those images, those activation patterns are still working in you. So you start to feel quite close to the images, you start to feel quite dependent, you start to feel personally affected. It's in your orbit of influence. So looking at violent images which feel close to you is more anxiety provoking than having the detachment of seeing. Just in the same way that we tend to be affected by news items which involve tragedies which happen near to us, geographically near to us. We tend to be more affected by those that happen on the other side of the planet. It's the same process in operation, but it's working on a metaphorical level. And conversely, if we've done this priming task where we've separated the dots by distance, our brains, our non-conscious parts of our minds, are working the ideas to do with distance, to do with separation, to do with detachment, to do with non-involvement, and non-dependence. And again, that carries over into the task. So we can look at sexually provocative images, or we can look at violent images, and we can kind of see it as feel ourselves. Because the feeling generated by this spatialization thing's going on, we can kind of feel ourselves distanced from it. We can place ourselves at a remove. We can feel detached. We can feel independent of it. And we can feel there's a lot of tolerance. And here I'm reminded of the engineering word tolerance, in which there's lots of, which is the measure of the degree of play in a piece of machinery. Lots of tolerance, lots of play in the measure between ourselves and the stimulus, the image. Yeah, I suppose how that relates to this thing about the sublime, I'm not sure it does terribly well, but what that's suggesting to me is that there are spatial concepts, spatial ideas going on, metaphorical spatial ideas, not literal spatial ideas, but metaphors of space, activation patterns to do with space going on in our brain, which have this kind of glow about them, or this set of connections, or this hum about them, which is affecting how we feel about the world and how we respond to the world. It's not just a felt thing, it's an actual response. We're making behavioural choices on the basis of these senses. And I think the Sublime is activating a similar thing. I think there's a spatial thing going on there. I think there's something going on here in which the dots on the imaginary graph paper are separated by this vastness, or is it the potential of this vast piece of graph paper that we suddenly feel that our brains are kind of keeping active. You know what I mean? Our brains are suddenly activating this vast piece of graph paper with dots separated by an immensity, and we feel so distanced, but also so oh God, I don't know, it's entirely cognitive, that's changing how we respond. It's changing how we value things. It's changing the kind of assignment that we give to value, the weighting that we give to certain value choices and certain entities and objects in the world. Maybe I need to do some work on language, I think, don't I? And now look how beautiful it is down here. Wow, look how beautiful. That's the River Dart. I'll just do a slow pan of the River Dart. Gorgeous. Okay.